Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. Please subscribe to this channel, share, like, as well as drop a comment on the comment section. Our lecture today is titled Diplomacy at the United Nations. Diplomacy at the United Nations. Now, the United Nations, being an association of sovereign countries in which the members are pledged under a charter to work for certain common ends, cannot be a place for the exercise of diplomacy in the classical sense of it, which is actually the conduct and business of the, between states on the basis of national interest. Now, the conception of the root of this world organization is that members, far from using it as a place to further their national interest, should subordinate their interest to the attainment of certain ends assumed to be in the common interest of all peace, with justice, development of friendly relations among peoples, and of course the promotion of the social and economic advancement of peoples. Now, in theory, members should all be outlined. Members should all be outbidding each other, for these ends. But the practice has fallen short of the theory, and it is in fact true to say that at present, diplomacy in the classical sense is commonly practiced, at the United Nations. Now, in another sense, diplomacy is defined as the practice of solving international conflict by peaceful rather than warlike means. That is, by the methods of negotiation and conciliation. Diplomacy, in this sense, is a proper international, it's a proper international activity at the United Nations, and indeed an activity, basic to the purposes laid down in the charter. Although much genuine effort is devoted, to utilizing the great potential of the United Nations for negotiation and conciliation, and the results have been encouraging, the other practice, utilization of the United Nations for national interest, has been followed by many member states, to the detriment of the practice of negotiation and conciliation and of the operation of the organization as a whole. So now let us look at the nature of the United Nations. What is the nature of the United Nations now? Now, the complexities of the international activity pursued at the United Nations are derived from the nature of the organization itself. The United Nations is a free association of sovereign states. Now, it is actually containing, as it does, several member countries. It now comes near to representing the totality of countries of the world with their many diverse traditions, institutions, and interests. Now, it is not a condition or an alliance with specific and binding conditions. This, of course, is how it differs fundamentally from other international organizations such as the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, where certain nations have joined together for well-defined common objectives and where decisions can be made and are taken in the common interest. Now, if the United Nations, functioned with theoretical, perfection, and all its members conducted their international affairs through the United Nations and subordinated their national interest to the requirements of the United Nations Charter, there would be no need for such other regional organizations. But this postulates an ideal, friction-free world, and the framers of the Charter themselves recognized that in Article 51 and 52, the justification of such collective security arrangements in present conditions. Now, in practice, the United Nations has not developed as the United States, who conceived the project, planned and hoped. The plan and hope was that it would provide an international forum in which all members would cooperate for the common ends. Now, difficulties have arisen from a number of factors, in the forefront of which must be placed the way the most powerful nations have treated the United Nations as place for the promotion of their national interest. Now, there have been the distortions of the aims of the Charter in favor of anti-colonialism and ultra-nationalism, which has complicated the task of the so-called colonial powers in making the contribution which they wish to make for the purposes of the Charter. And finally, there has developed a double standard of behavior as apartheid, as applied to different parts of the world. Despite all these complications, the United Nations has made and is making an essential contribution to the international peace and stability. But in order to understand how it really works and how diplomatic activities is conducted at the United Nations, it is essentially to prove that the task of international diplomacy is complicated by the factors, enumerated. Now, let us look at the misuse of the United Nations. The difficulties, let us look at the misuse, how, the United Nations has been misused over the years. Now, the difficulties with world powerful nations, as reflected at the United Nations, have risen from the fact that these major powers have blocked so many serious efforts to deal with world problems, and lately have even exploited the organization as a vehicle for their own national ambitions. This has caused the democratic world to spend much time and efforts in circumventing and countering these tactics. This has been a major task for diplomacy and has complicated efforts, to move towards the objectives which the founders of the United Nations had in mind. Perhaps the greatest damage to the effectiveness of the organization has resulted from the behavior of the permanent members in the Security Council, where they have the veto. The Security Council was intended to be an executive arm with major responsibility for peace and security. The Security Council has been gravely handicapped in this role by the misuse of the veto power by the permanent members in order to frustrate some moves genuinely designed to preserve peace and security, or to promote some particular national aim of their own. Okay, so in the wider forum provided by the General Assembly during its annual 3-month session, much time has been wasted and useful initiative has come to nothing, owing to the propagandist use to which these meetings were turned to, especially during the Cold War era. The Soviet line was to play on the fear of war, using the slogan of peaceful coexistence and presenting themselves as the true apostles of peace and progress, and the Western powers as aggressive troublemakers and imperialists. Now, opportunities were not lost to intensify this propaganda effort by capitalizing their remarkable advances in science, and by alternating peace propaganda with intimidation. With the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union, United States of America has turned itself into the policeman of the world, using the United Nations as an instrument to actualize its national interest. There is hardly any distinction now between the US decisions and decisions of the Security Council. In the United Nations, The task is not only to conduct this kind of propaganda, but in spite of it, to create and maintain conditions favorable to conciliation, agreement, to conciliation and of course agreement. This requires considerable effort and unremitting patience. Okay, conciliation and agreement is indeed the main function of the United Nations, especially the permanent members of the Security Council working together and the United Nations being given executive power for the collective security. The belief that is that more emphasis should be laid than at present on the main functions of the United Nations, a world forum and clearinghouse for ideas, a place where countries are influenced by the opinions of other countries and by world opinion, a center where foreign representatives can meet, talk quietly, and get to know each other. Okay, so those are just the major things. Now, the last thing we need to look at is open debate and what? And private diplomacy. Open debate and private diplomacy. These are less clear-cut issues where strains are liable, to arise for friendships within the free world when a matter is raised in the United Nations. The difficulties arise largely from the simple fact that they are raised in the United Nations. The United Nations proceedings are public and its decisions are taken by voting. This has value when some broad issues of international concern are being debated. But when it is a specific issue affecting the vital interest of a major power, this open procedure can prove awkward, a problem which might be solved by the old-fashioned methods of private non-publicized diplomacy often becomes intractable when debated in the United Nations. A relatively minor problem becomes magnified out of proportion to its true importance owing to the clash of differing views in the debate at the United Nations. But private diplomacy is not unfashionable. It has come to be regarded as positively immoral. This is perhaps, because private diplomacy smells of secret diplomacy, and secret diplomacy in the particular mind is plotting behind people's backs. Now, yet open covenants privately arrived at is often the best method of agreement. Now, covenants are often not arrived at all if they have to be reached through the medium of public debate. Now, the moral for diplomacy at the United Nations is more restraint in advocating the treatment, of thorny questions in public debate and greater use of many alternative media available in the flexible organization of the United Nations. Thank you very much.